The chamber was already humming with tension when Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with fire. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The weight of her words carried all the voltage the room could handle. "Pam Bondi," she began, her gaze locked and unwavering, "can you explain your ties to Epstein's legal team?" In that instant, the air seemed to snap. Chairs creaked as heads turned. A ripple of whispers tore across the hall like a sudden gust of wind. Even the faint click of cameras grew frantic, shutters swallowing the silence that Pam Bondi could not fill. For years, Bondi had cultivated the aura of untouchable authority, the polished defender of power cloaked in smiles and sound bites. But now, under the piercing clarity of Crockett's question, the façade trembled. Her jaw tightened, her lips parted, but no words emerged fast enough to mask the shock. Around them, murmurs escalated. Staffers leaned in toward their phones, reporters exchanged wide-eyed glances, and an unmistakable electricity surged through the room. The question was more than an inquiry. It was a gauntlet thrown, a mirror held up to everything the public had long suspected but rarely heard spoken so plainly, so boldly, in such a sacred chamber. Bondi's silence became its own indictment, every second stretching longer, heavier, more suffocating. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't fidget. She sat still as a statue, her expression carved with the kind of calm that comes only when truth is your weapon. The audience knew this was not politics as usual. This was confrontation in its rawest form, the clash of two legacies, one built on shielding privilege, the other on exposing it. And in that moment, the scales felt like they might finally tip. Gasps gave way to murmurs, murmurs to a rising chorus of disbelief. A single question had pierced the bubble, and what came next promised either unraveling or revelation. What happened in the next 30 seconds left the entire chamber in stunned silence, and the nation about to witness a showdown it would not forget. The hearing had not been designed for fireworks. On paper, it was supposed to be another round of legal parsing and political grandstanding, the kind of routine Washington theater that fills the record but rarely makes the evening news. Yet from the moment Jasmine Crockett walked into that room, it was clear the script had been rewritten. The question she hurled was not simply a procedural probe. It was dynamite placed at the fault line of American power, and the name it carried, Epstein, was the fuse. Few names in recent history have cut so sharply into the nation's conscience. Epstein was not just a man. He was a symbol of corruption's ugliest bargain, wealth and status shielding predators from justice, while victims' cries were drowned out by money and influence. To invoke that name in this setting was to summon the ghosts of scandals past, the ones America still struggles to reconcile. And there sat Pam Bondi, a woman who had navigated decades of politics with a practiced smile and a Rolodex of powerful allies. As Florida's Attorney General, she projected the image of fierce law and order, a protector of communities, a guardian of children. She polished that brand so brightly it gleamed on the national stage, eventually aligning herself with the Trump orbit and cashing in her credibility as a TV commentator. But beneath the surface, cracks had long been whispered about. Her selective battles, her carefully chosen targets, the convenient blind spots that seemed to shield her donors and punish her opponents. Bondi was not merely another official. She was part of a machinery that many Americans had come to distrust, a machinery that appeared to defend the powerful while demanding obedience from everyone else. That is why Crockett's question didn't just hang in the air. It detonated. By linking Bondi's name with Epstein's legal web, Crockett transformed the hearing from routine oversight into a reckoning. Suddenly, the stakes were no longer about procedural minutiae. They were about the soul of American justice itself. Was the system truly blind, or had it been hijacked by those with the deepest pockets and dirtiest secrets? Bondi's legacy was on the table. The years she had spent cultivating influence now looked like liabilities waiting to be dragged into the light. Every twitch, every pause, Every deflection she attempted would be read not as composure but as confirmation. The hearing chamber, once a sterile arena of political rhetoric, had become a crucible where reputations could be destroyed in real time. And the audience, inside the room and across the nation, felt it. This wasn't a clash of personalities. It was a collision of narratives, the old guard of privilege defending its throne versus a new voice unwilling to let silence shield the powerful. In that collision lay a question every American was asking themselves. If someone like Bondi could be forced to answer, maybe, just maybe, justice wasn't entirely dead. The silence stretched, the tension thickened, and the cameras kept rolling. What began as routine had become historic. Crockett had shifted the ground beneath Bondi's feet, and the tremors were only just beginning. But Crockett wasn't finished. The deeper she went, the higher the stakes became for Bondi. Long before her name was whispered in the same breath as Epstein's legal machinery, Pam Bondi had carved out a reputation in Florida as a woman draped in authority. She rose through the ranks of prosecutors' offices with a sharp tongue and an iron confidence, selling herself as the immovable defender of law and order. By the time she took office as Florida's Attorney General in 2011, she embodied the image of a polished enforcer. Tough on crime, protective of families, the smiling warrior who promised Floridians she would guard their safety with unyielding resolve. On television, she was flawless. A blonde mane, a practiced cadence, a voice that could sound compassionate one moment and scathing the next. Bondi became a familiar face on cable news, the law and order personality who always had a quip ready for the cameras. She leaned into that spotlight, knowing it amplified her authority. To many voters, she looked like the archetype of justice itself, a woman who could be trusted to stand between the people and the predators who threatened them. But beneath the shine of her image, the contradictions grew impossible to ignore. Time and again, her selective crusades revealed a troubling pattern. When wealthy donors found themselves under scrutiny, somehow the wheels of justice slowed. Campaign contributions from powerful corporations and influential figures seemed to insulate them from the kinds of prosecutions ordinary Floridians endured without mercy. The very badge she wore, as a symbol of fairness, began to look like a shield wielded on behalf of the privileged. One of the sharpest dents in her armor came when questions surfaced about a $25,000 donation her political committee received from Donald Trump's foundation, just days after her office declined to pursue fraud allegations against Trump University. Bondi brushed it off as coincidence, but to ordinary citizens, it reeked of a transaction, the sort of pay-to-play politics that corrodes faith in democracy. Here was the so-called champion of justice, apparently looking the other way when the powerful were involved. Bondi's alignment with Trump only deepened those doubts. She became one of his most loyal defenders, often appearing on television to rationalize his excesses, to justify his attacks on opponents, to lend her credibility to a man whose name was already synonymous with scandal. The law and order prosecutor had recast herself as a partisan warrior, wielding her past reputation not to expose corruption, but to shield it. And then came the whispers, the associations no polished statement could erase. Her connections to men who moved in the same circles as Jeffrey Epstein, her work intersecting with firms and figures who had tangled with the disgraced financier's world. Bondi never stood accused of Epstein's crimes, but in the public eye, proximity was enough. When the nation still reeled from revelations of the sweetheart deal Epstein received in Florida, a deal brokered by officials meant to defend victims, any tie, however tangential, felt like complicity. For victims and their families, her silence on the subject was deafening. Here was a woman who built her career vowing to protect the vulnerable, yet she never raised her voice against one of the most notorious predators of the modern era. Instead, her loyalty to the same political network that had coddled Epstein only deepened suspicions. She became a symbol not of accountability, but of the immunity enjoyed by those at the top. To her supporters, she remained polished and photogenic, forever ready with a practiced smile. To her critics, she was the very embodiment of hypocrisy, the protector of justice who shielded the powerful, the enforcer of law who bent it when it served her allies. That duality made her both formidable and fragile, a woman who looked invincible on camera but carried the weight of compromises too heavy to ignore. And yet, for years, she had managed to skate by untouched. The headlines faded, the scandals softened under the churn of the news cycle. Bondi had become adept at waiting out the outrage, at letting time bury questions that might have buried her. But in this hearing there was no time, no refuge in spin, no shelter in silence. Jasmine Crockett's question had ripped through the protective veneer Bondi had spent decades crafting. For once, she could not control the narrative. And yet in this hearing, her past caught up with her, in the form of Jasmine Crockett. Long before she found herself staring down Pam Bondi across a congressional hearing room, Jasmine Crockett's story began in the kind of place where nothing was guaranteed except the value of hard work. She was not born into privilege or legacy. She grew up in a world that often demanded more from her than it gave, where ambition wasn't a hobby but a survival skill. In classrooms that didn't always expect much from kids who looked like her, she learned quickly that her sharp mind and unflinching voice were her only tools to carve out space. That resolve carried her into law school, where the grind was not merely academic but existential. While others coasted on family connections or financial cushions, Crockett fought for every inch. She spent long nights under flickering library lights, translating complex cases into her own rhythms, refusing to let the weight of the system crush her determination. The law was not abstract to her, it was personal. It was the difference between communities left unprotected and communities finally heard. When she graduated and chose civil rights advocacy, it wasn't the path of least resistance. It was the path of greatest need. Crockett walked straight into courtrooms where the odds were stacked against her, defending clients who couldn't pay her what her time was worth, people who carried the bruises of injustice not just on their bodies but in their records, their housing applications, their schools. She took on impossible cases, cases colleagues warned would lead nowhere, because she believed the fight itself had value, even when victory seemed out of reach. And she won more than anyone expected, not because the system was built to let her, but because she refused to be rattled. That became her defining trait, unshakable calm in the face of arrogance. Opposing lawyers would sneer, judges would interrupt, but Crockett's composure never cracked. She knew that every eye roll, every condescending smirk was meant to throw her off balance. She also knew that when she stayed steady, when she refused to mirror the ugliness thrown her way, she exposed her opponents, weakness for all to see. That composure followed her into public life. On Capitol Hill, in hearings brimming with hostility, she never mistook volume for strength. She let others rant and rave, their faces red with frustration, while she sliced through the noise with surgical precision. Clips of her exchanges began circulating on social media, each one a masterclass in turning arrogance into ashes. Young people saw in her a mirror of their own battles with authority figures who dismissed them. Women saw a fearless example of refusing to shrink under pressure. Communities of color saw someone who had walked through the same fires and carried their stories into the halls of power. Her comebacks became viral moments not because they were rehearsed, but because they were real. They carried the cadence of lived experience, the sting of truth delivered without apology. On platforms where cynicism usually wins, her words inspired something rarer: pride. Her presence became a reminder that politics didn't have to be dominated by the polished heirs of dynasties, that sometimes someone who had fought every step of the way could stand taller than those who had everything handed to them. This lived experience was exactly what made her the perfect counterweight to Pam Bondi. Where Bondi's rise had been cushioned by networks of privilege, Crockett's ascent had been uphill, carved from stone with bare hands. Where Bondi weaponized image, Crockett wielded authenticity. Where Bondi aligned with the powerful, Crockett aligned with the silenced. These contrasts weren't just biographical, they were ideological. They shaped how each woman confronted the world, and explained why one would crumble under the kind of question the other would never fear to ask. Crockett's strength didn't come from insulation, it came from scars. From walking into rooms where she was underestimated, where her credentials were scrutinized more harshly than her peers, where she had to prove twice over what others received by default. Every time someone told her she couldn't, she sharpened her focus. Every time she was told to sit down, she stood taller. That history was etched into her voice when she spoke, and audiences could hear it. They didn't just listen to her words, they felt the weight of the journey that delivered them. So when she leaned across that table to ask Bondi about Epstein, she wasn't just another lawmaker making noise for the cameras. She was the culmination of a lifetime spent fighting systems designed to minimize her, turning those same systems into platforms where her calm became the loudest thunder. Her supporters knew it, her critics feared it, and Bondi in that moment could sense it. Crockett represented not just a question but a reckoning with every compromised official, every polished figure who thought arrogance could mask complicity. And on this day, that calm firepower was about to meet its greatest test yet. The silence that followed Crockett's opening strike seemed to stretch on forever, but she didn't leave it there. She adjusted her papers with deliberate calm, glanced up, and launched her next question in a voice so measured it cut sharper than any shout. "Ms. Bondi, you've spoken at length about protecting families, about defending victims. Could you walk us through a single case where you chose to prosecute someone with the same wealth and power as the people funding your campaigns?" It was not a roar, not even a raised eyebrow, just precision. Bondi blinked rapidly, leaned back in her chair, and forced a thin smile. She offered a canned line about her record, about her commitment to justice. But her words were vague, her phrasing slippery, and everyone in the room knew it. Crockett nodded, as though she had expected nothing more. Then came the next question, each one narrowing the field like a prosecutor cornering a witness. "When you declined to pursue Trump University fraud allegations, was that decision made before or after your office received a donation from the Trump Foundation?" A smirk flickered across Bondi's face, the kind meant to project confidence but that instead looked like a tell. "Congresswoman, I find it interesting you're recycling conspiracy theories," she replied, her tone dipped in sarcasm. Crockett didn't flinch. She let the smirk hang in the air until it wilted. Then she pressed on. Her cadence was slow, deliberate, impossible to deflect without exposing something. Each new question stacked atop the last like bricks in a wall Bondi couldn't climb over. "Do you deny?" Crockett asked, her eyes never leaving Bondi. "That money has influenced the decisions you've made as an officer of the court." Bondi leaned forward now, her voice rising. She interrupted, deflected, even chuckled at one point, as though laughter could dissolve accountability. But the chuckle rang hollow, its nervous edge betraying what the polished mask could not. Around them, the chamber was shifting. Lawmakers who moments earlier sat scrolling on their phones now leaned in, sensing the current. Staffers began whispering hurriedly, exchanging looks that said they, too, knew something was unraveling. The press gallery stirred, pens scratching, cameras swiveling to capture every tick of Bondi's discomfort. And still Crockett stayed poised. She didn't match Bondi's rising tone. She didn't mirror the smirks. She built her case brick by brick, calmly, steadily, her voice gaining power not by volume but by inevitability. She was less a participant in a political spat and more a litigator constructing a closing argument before a jury of millions. Bondi shifted in her seat, crossing her arms, then uncrossing them. Her practiced smile returned, but it didn't stick. She tried pivoting to her familiar talking points about law and order, but Crockett cut neatly through the deflection. "Law and order," Crockett repeated softly, as if tasting the words. "That's a powerful phrase, But isn't law meaningless if order is only applied to the powerless? The chamber went quiet again. Even the shuffle of papers stopped. The weight of the question hovered, its force multiplied by Crockett's composure. Bondi opened her mouth, closed it, then glanced down at her notes as though they might rescue her. The room had tipped. What began as routine posturing now felt like the unraveling of a façade. Crockett had turned Bondi's arrogance into evidence, her interruptions into exhibits of weakness, her smirks into silent confessions. But Crockett wasn't rushing to the finish. She was circling, letting the tension coil tighter, letting the anticipation build. The murmurs in the chamber had grown into a buzz, the kind that signals an audience knows a blow is coming and can barely wait for it to land. And that was when Crockett paused, letting her silence speak louder than Bondi's noise. She leaned in once more, eyes narrowed not with anger but with resolve. The entire room braced. But Crockett was saving her sharpest question for last. For several minutes, Jasmine Crockett had danced Bondi into a corner. Every polite but piercing question cut away a layer of pretense until only raw defensiveness remained. The chamber buzzed with restless anticipation, the kind of nervous energy that precedes either collapse or explosion. Crockett sensed it. She let the silence expand one more beat, then delivered the question that would sear itself into headlines. "Pam Bondi," she said, her voice as steady as stone, "can you explain your ties to Epstein's legal team?" The effect was instant. Bondi froze, her smile collapsing like glass under pressure. The smug confidence that had carried her through years of television appearances evaporated. For the first time in the hearing, she looked startled, not irritated, not dismissive, but genuinely caught off guard. Her mouth opened slightly, but the words jammed at her throat. The chamber reacted before she did. A wave of gasps rippled across the room. Pens scratched furiously, cameras pivoted to catch her expression. Staffers leaned over their laptops, fingers flying across keyboards to capture the moment in real time. It was the kind of silence that wasn't empty but thunderous, filled with the collective recognition that something historic had just been said. Bondi blinked hard, forced a swallow, then attempted to recover. "Congresswoman, I think it's irresponsible to throw out baseless accusations." Her voice cracked on irresponsible, the word failing to land with its usual sharpness. She gave a strained laugh, but it rang hollow, almost desperate. Crockett didn't move, didn't raise her voice. "Baseless. The records are clear. Your former firm was engaged in work connected to Epstein's defense team. Are you denying that?" A bead of sweat slid near Bondi's hairline. She dabbed at her face with a tissue she hadn't needed moments earlier. I wasn't personally involved," she stammered, "and this is irrelevant." Crockett cut in, not with aggression, but with calm authority. "Irrelevant to you, perhaps. Not irrelevant to the survivors who wonder why people in positions of power stayed silent. Not irrelevant to a public that's asked again and again why the wealthy find defenders while victims are forced to fight alone." The words landed like a hammer. In the back rows, someone whispered "wow," audible enough for microphones to catch. The chamber leaned forward as if pulled by a string. Bondi shuffled her papers, tried to regain composure. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, this hearing is not the place for." Crockett struck again, her tone unshaken. "This hearing is exactly the place. Because if the people can't demand answers in this room, then where? If accountability doesn't start here, then where does it start?" It was not grandstanding. It was precision, the kind of courtroom cadence Crockett had honed for years. Each phrase was a scalpel, carving away excuses until Bondi had nowhere left to retreat. The more Bondi interrupted, the smaller she seemed, her defensiveness betraying her far louder than any admission could. Meanwhile, the cameras lingered on Crockett's expression, calm, resolute, almost surgical. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even smiling. She was delivering a truth she had carried into countless fights before, truth as steady as gravity, impossible to shake no matter how the powerful squirmed. Bondi's voice rose again, tinged now with panic. "Congresswoman, this is an outrageous line of questioning." Crockett raised an eyebrow, her reply slicing through the air. "What's outrageous is a justice system that bends for the privileged while breaking the powerless. What's outrageous is watching officials protect predators while silencing survivors. And what's truly outrageous, Ms. Bondi, is pretending that ties to Epstein's world are somehow beneath the public's right to know." The chamber erupted, not in chaos, but in the unmistakable sound of suppressed gasps and murmurs of agreement. It was as though Crockett had articulated what everyone else had been waiting to hear, but hadn't dared to speak aloud. Bondi tried again, this time forcing a laugh. "This is political theater," she scoffed, but her voice betrayed the quiver beneath the words. She shifted in her seat, her body language betraying unease. Crockett didn't rise to the bait. She leaned back slightly, folded her hands, and let the silence choke the room once more. Bondi fidgeted, searching for lifelines in her notes, in the eyes of her allies across the dais, but none came. Then Crockett spoke again, softer this time, almost reflective. "You call it theater. I call it accountability. And accountability is not optional, not for the powerless and not for you." The chamber fell utterly still. Even Bondi's defenders hesitated, unsure how to jump into the breach without being swallowed by it. In the press gallery, phones lit up as reporters tweeted in real time. Social media staffers were already splicing clips, knowing this moment would explode across timelines before the hearing was even adjourned. The hashtags were practically writing themselves. Bondi's mask, polished over years of media training and power networking, was crumbling live on camera. The condescension, the smirks, the practiced dismissals, all of it had dissolved into stammers and defensive laughter. Against Crockett's calm firepower, arrogance had finally met its match. And still, Crockett didn't gloat. She let the silence linger a final time, ensuring that the weight of her words could not be dismissed as noise. Her composure was her victory, her calm the loudest rebuke of all. Bondi's shoulders slumped, her responses reduced to mutters that even microphones barely caught. In that moment, the balance had shifted entirely. The once untouchable Bondi sat exposed, while Crockett, steady and unyielding, rose as the embodiment of courage confronting corruption. The chamber would remember it, the nation would replay it, but the showdown didn't end there. The echoes of Crockett's question would not remain confined to that room. Because the takedown didn't end in that room, it exploded far beyond those walls. It didn't take long for the sparks inside that chamber to ignite a wildfire outside. The moment Jasmine Crockett uttered Epstein's name, the cameras had already caught everything: the hesitation, the crack in Bondi's voice, the collective gasp that rippled through the room. By the time the hearing adjourned, clips of the exchange were already circulating online. Within an hour, they had gone viral. On Twitter, now X, the hashtags materialized instantly. Pam exposed, Crockett the closer, accountability now. Millions of users shared the clip, each adding their own commentary. Some called it the question heard around the world. Others simply wrote, "Play it again," looping the takedown in endless reposts. By midnight, Crockett's name trended globally, overtaking celebrity scandals and sports scores. Memes followed with lightning speed. One showed Bondi mid-stammer, overlaid with the caption, "When you thought you were untouchable but forgot about receipts." Another split-screen Crockett's calm stare with a crumbling facade of Bondi, the text reading, "Justice stays calm, corruption sweats." The humor was sharp, but underneath it was something deeper, a sense that for once arrogance had met a reckoning and lost. Cable news couldn't resist. Anchors on MSNBC replayed the clip on loop, framing Crockett as a rising force redefining congressional hearings. CNN analysts broke down Bondi's body language, pointing out the tightening jaw, the shifting eyes, the nervous tissue dab as signs of panic. Even late-night hosts seized the moment, turning Bondi's political theater line into a punchline. Audiences laughed, but the laughter carried an unmistakable edge of catharsis. Celebrities joined the chorus. Kerry Washington tweeted, "This is what holding power accountable looks like." Mark Ruffalo called Crockett's performance a masterclass in calm courage. Within hours, TikTok creators had stitched Crockett's words into remixes, montages, and motivational edits. One viral soundbite, her line, "Accountability is not optional," became the soundtrack for thousands of videos, from activists posting protest footage to teenagers sharing their own fights against authority. Meanwhile, Bondi's defenders scrambled to mount a counter-narrative. Conservative outlets tried to paint Crockett as grandstanding, but their clips never landed with the same force. Bondi herself attempted damage control with a carefully worded statement, dismissing the hearing as a distraction from real issues. Yet even that was drowned out by the sheer volume of ridicule online. In digital culture, perception is power, and in perception, Bondi was no longer formidable, she was a meme. Crockett, on the other hand, ascended to something larger than politician. She became a folk hero, a symbol of speaking truth to entrenched privilege. Young activists shared her clip alongside archival footage of Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, and Maxine Waters, placing Crockett in a continuum of fearless women who stood unshaken before power. For immigrant families, for marginalized voices, for anyone who had been dismissed by the smugness of the powerful, Crockett's composure was vindication. But it wasn't just identity, it was strategy. Commentators noted that Crockett hadn't shouted, hadn't played into caricatures. She had wielded silence, calm, and precision as weapons. She didn't just win the exchange, one analyst wrote. She redefined how accountability can look, measured, unflinching, undeniable. The ripple effect stretched beyond television studios and Twitter timelines. College students organized watch parties, replaying the clip as if it were a championship game. Grassroots organizations sent fundraising emails, featuring Crockett's quote as a rallying cry. Even in workplaces and community centers, people whispered about that question, replaying the moment over lunch breaks and church meetings. The story had transcended politics. It became cultural shorthand, a single clip symbolizing the possibility that entrenched power could be challenged, and challenged successfully. And yet, as the frenzy built, something larger was forming. Because Crockett didn't just win a moment, she reframed an entire conversation on power and justice. When the echoes of the hearing began to settle, and the viral storm took on a life of its own, Jasmine Crockett's words stood out not just as a sharp political jab, but as a moral anchor. She had done more than expose the cracks in one person's carefully cultivated image. She reminded America of something it too often forgets: that justice must always outweigh privilege. In that chamber, it wasn't about Crockett versus Bondi alone. It was about two competing visions of what this country could be. On one side stood the defenders of status, wealth, and secrecy, people who believed connections could shield them from accountability. On the other side stood a woman who had built her career not on privilege but on grit, on the relentless pursuit of fairness for those who rarely see it. The clash was not simply political, it was existential. Epstein's name had carried weight because it represented the ugliest proof of what happens when privilege goes unchecked. Victims silenced, predators protected, systems manipulated. By daring to bring that name into the light, Crockett shattered the illusion that certain figures could float above consequence. She transformed what could have been just another exchange into a universal reminder. Silence only feeds corruption, but speaking truth, even when the room grows tense, has the power to shift history. And that is why her composure mattered so much. She did not raise her voice. She did not pound the table. She relied on something far more powerful: dignity. In that calm, unflinching tone, she showed that dignity is not weakness but strength. True leadership does not come from arrogance, from smirks, or from belittling opponents. It comes from the courage to confront lies with clarity and to carry the weight of justice even when it is inconvenient. For every immigrant who has been told to stay quiet, for every woman dismissed as too emotional, for every community made to feel powerless in the face of wealth and connections, Crockett's stance was a declaration. Your voice matters. Your dignity matters. And when wielded with truth, it can topple even the most carefully guarded reputations. This was bigger than politics. It was about the fabric of America itself, whether we choose to keep bending to those who exploit privilege, or whether we rise again and again to demand that dignity defines us. Crockett's stand became proof that integrity, though often underestimated, can outshine even the brightest armor of corruption. And so, as the cameras moved on and the hashtags trended, the deeper story remained. Leadership shaped by arrogance crumbles under scrutiny, but leadership rooted in justice endures. Crockett reminded the nation that while privilege may silence for a season, truth has a way of finding its voice. And that's why this story doesn't end here. One question. That's all it took to shatter the carefully guarded façade Pam Bondi had built over decades. One Epstein question, asked with precision, with calm, with the weight of justice behind it, left her exposed before the nation. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett proved that truth, spoken without fear, can dismantle even the most polished image of power. This was never just about Bondi. It was about a system that has too often shielded privilege while silencing the vulnerable. Crockett's stand was a reminder that corruption can be challenged, that dignity can triumph over arrogance, and that real leadership is measured not in connections, but in courage. Crockett stood tall not only for herself, but for every person who has ever been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated. She became a symbol of what it looks like when justice refuses to bow, when silence is broken, and when the powerful are finally forced to answer. And here where you come in. If this moment resonated with you, don't let it fade. Share it. Talk about it. Keep it alive. Because every view, every share, every conversation helps make sure that truth is louder than privilege. Subscribe to this channel, join this community, and be part of amplifying voices that refuse to be silenced. Together, we can ensure that what happened in that chamber doesn't remain a fleeting headline, but becomes part of a growing movement for accountability and dignity. Because when voices like Crockett's rise, silence is no longer an option. And when silence is broken, justice has a chance to breathe. This story doesn't end here. It continues with all of us.